Now, how has digital technology, and this is probably a good question for the Chief of Mission, how has digital technology been used effectively to facilitate binational relationships on the border? And I know you mentioned some briefly, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more. And also with respect to what Mrs. De La Vega Foster was saying, how can we really, I guess, democratize that or open that up to a wider a group of people? As we know, we have so many students from Ciudad Juárez coming over. That's just one example. But these deep familial bonds that we have here from centuries prior, how can we, as you said, it's not coming back the way it used to be, but how can we sort of mitigate this trouble?
Mitigate the trouble that
Or the difficulty in crossing. How can digital technology start helping
Well, it's
us?
doing it. I just crossed over from Juarez and had my global entry card. The car I was in had its Sentry sensor, and we came across in, I don't think the whole process took more than 60 seconds from the time we pulled up to the kiosk till the time we were through on the other side. So I think a lot of that's being done. I mentioned earlier those pre-inspection projects. You know, I think it's important to have a vision. I guess my vision or my hope is that before too many more years go by, there's going to be an aerospace component manufacturer in Querétaro, and he's going to make his component, he's going to put it on a truck. Mexican SAT and CBP are going to inspect it, put some incredibly high-tech electronic seal, which they've tried to explain to me, but I still don't understand, on the truck, and it's going to take off, and it's not going to stop except to get gas between Querétaro and Everett, Washington, where it's going to go in a Boeing aircraft. That's where I think we're headed.
That's very, very interesting. How also then, here's another question for the panel, and maybe this is for everybody. And in particular, I'd just like to preface this question with a little bit of a regional historical perspective. In many ways, the El Paso Juárez region and New Mexico region is the oldest along the border. We have settlements here dating from 400 years ago, and not even to mention the indigenous communities that were here earlier. And over time, we've seen that there have been divisions, there have been revolutions, there have been wars of independence, there's been invasions, there's been civil wars that have all happened here and have, in some ways, done a job of creating maybe, let's say, mistrust, and in particular between the US and Mexico. Now, so the question that is here is how can we bridge the credibility and trust gap, if you feel there even is one, between Mexico and the US?
Me parece que uno de los problemas que tenemos es que no entendemos que muchos problemas son compartidos, que no solo se hace historia alrededor de las fronteras, sino que la frontera en sí misma va haciendo historia y va cambiando, y esa es la naturaleza también de nuestros países. Si nosotros no entendemos que ahora sí que además con la tecnología todo cambia mucho más rápido y las decisiones debieran ser también mucho más ágiles, vamos a seguir quedándonos atrás de esta misma historia, en lugar de responder a las necesidades que sería nuestro trabajo. Parte, por ejemplo, volviendo al tema del señor Trump, parte de lo que no entiende es la misma historia de los Estados Unidos. Él va ahorita a discriminar a mexicanos, pero no sabemos si al día siguiente discrimine a otras comunidades por su origen étnico, religioso o por su país de origen. Entonces, cuando vemos gente con estos discursos retrógradas, pues justamente lo que la clase política y como sociedad debemos hacer es empujar un nuevo dinamismo que haga historia en la frontera y que no se siga quedando atrás con decisiones que debieran haber sucedido hace 25 años.
Would you have any thoughts, Mr. Duncan, on this issue?
I have an anecdote.
Please.
I'm not to this day sure exactly what it means. I spent 3 years as the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, Spain, which is a nice job if you can get it. And one of the things I used to do regularly was go to Spanish universities and talk about U.S. foreign policy. It was during the Iraq War was a very hot topic. Guantanamo, we were not very popular in Spain at the moment. So those encounters were incredibly difficult. It'd be a room with this many kids in it, and they would just beat me to death. And I would do the very best I could, And inevitably, there would be 2 or 3 Mexican students in the group. And it's hard for me to explain, but the interaction with the 2 or 3 Mexican students, there was a connection. It was very natural. We clearly had something in common as North Americans that neither of us had with the Spaniards in the room. And I always take enormous heart from that, because I think our countries, all 3 of the countries, are getting closer together. Mexico is not the same country today in terms of its relationship with the United States and its attitudes towards the United States that I entered for the first time on April Fool's Day, 1993. The relationship has changed fundamentally. In spite of some of the ugliness in our political process, in spite of some of the things you hear people say in both countries, the countries are closer today than they were 20 years ago.
And what would your thoughts be, Mrs. De La Vega Foster, with respect to this acercamiento and mejoramiento de relaciones?
No, I agree with Mr. Duncan. I mean, when you talk about the benefits of the U.S., why would we care about Mexico? It's because we're neighbors. We're neighbors, and it's better to be able to consolidate a North American bloc. People tend to think about NAFTA as this ugly thing for Americans. And it's not NAFTA, it's globalization that has taken jobs from the US, because the nature of the US, the economy in the US is to go towards the service economy. And that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It means you're paying too much per hour for some of the manufacturing jobs. And if it wasn't Mexico, it's China or India, or, you know, there's many other countries. That sometimes interferes with our ability to do things together, but it shouldn't, because, you know, that has to do with the world global economy is going. And it would be better and safer for the 3 countries to work together and to consolidate as a bloc. And by the way, going back to the Trump question, one thing that amazes me is not that somebody can say something like that, because, you know, whatever, just don't hear him. You can, you know, think he's whatever. But that he goes up in polls. That's what's amazing to me, and that's what sometimes makes Mexicans think Americans don't like us. It's not only Trump saying it, is him going up in the polls that makes you think, wow, so they do support him. That's...
Yeah, and I think that we're family members, Mexico and the United States, that are just becoming closer and closer and developing more and more trust. And this poignant anecdote that the chief of mission mentioned really, I think, points to that. And I think that, you know, I see it daily, and the mutual, I don't even really like to use the word dependency. We're inextricably linked. I think that's a better way to say it. As we said earlier, familially, culturally, economically, with respect to natural resources, supply chains, foreign investment, everything. How can, again, we use this vision to really, what kind of practical things can we do to make sure that there's a better consciousness of that kind of mutuality of respect and that mutuality of reliance in all places throughout Mexico and throughout what would be referred to as the heartland of the United States, where I think there might be less of an understanding of how valuable we are to each other and how important we are to each other. What was your thoughts beyond that?
I mean, just it gets back to my very beginning statements, Patrick, that, and I think Trump's reaction in the polls is troubling, but it's, to me, just a reinforcement and a signal that we haven't done our jobs, and once again, I put more responsibility on those on the border to try to communicate the value proposition of the border, the value proposition of Mexico, try to put a lens on our policies that are based on what makes us more world competitive. And if you start there, if you can get some common agreement around we need to be competitive for other regions, against other regions in the world. Our region is defined to include North America. How does any policy And then you begin to say, well, wait, this policy that's interdicting us at the border is interfering with our competitiveness, our income, our quality of life. And then you begin, but you've got to get that common agreement, and obviously you could look at those polls and say, we've got a part of the population that is not bought into the value proposition. And there's much to be done on the education side. But I'm optimistic it can be done. I think the timeline is maybe more of a question.
Yes, I'm very optimistic as well, and I think just this gathering here and the energy that could be felt outside and in the room today, and really demonstrates the power that we are having as a region to speak on our own behalf and to really reach out and change minds and make sure that policies and regulations really work to our advantage here, not just for border communities, but for the binational and North American economy as well. We just have a few moments left before we have to close our session, but just to sort of summarize our thoughts here today, it's clear that there is really a need to focus on the human element of our relationship as well, and not just mere trade. And there's also, I think, the wonderful opportunity that all of us have working on this human element to reach out to all areas, whether it's in Chicago or Washington or Mexico City, to really make sure that this is happening. And what is so, I think, impressive about this panel is that they're really doing that. They're really sort of vocalizing this and making tremendous efforts with Borderplex Alliance, with the soccer teams and the baseball teams that are here, and the other kind of public-private partnerships that are going on. And also all the work and time that you have dedicated to your revolving relationship with Mexico at every 10 years. So, and to the senator who made a great effort to come here and be with us and share her thoughts from the Mexican Senate and from the Capitol to really give us a more nuanced understanding of how we're seen and appreciated in the capital of the Mexican Republic. So I just wanted to say thank you again on behalf of Congressman O'Rourke, on behalf of President Natalicio, and welcome to El Paso, welcome to our home. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. Welcome to El Paso again, I'm sure. And thank you all for taking your time to be with us. Thank you.